after that kind of crazy story that we're still trying to get our minds around about Judah and Tamar, maybe we need to step back and ask, whatever happened to Joseph? Remember chapter 37, he's introduced. It seems like he's going to be the guy, right? He has the dreams of dominion. But where did the story leave off with him, and what happened to him? Do you remember what it was? He was thrown down into the pit by his brothers who hated him. But then instead of killing him, remember, they saw this Ishmaelite caravan coming by. They thought, hey, we can make some money on him at least. And so what do? They sell him. Sell him to become like a slave. Who knows what's going to happen to him? They sell him for, 20 shekels of silver, and they think they're done with him. But where did those Ishmaelite people take him? They seem to be like traders. Where are they going to take him? Who are they going to sell him to? Well, chapter 39, we come back to Joseph. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So that's where he goes. Joseph, 17-year-old Hebrew young man, abandoned by his brothers, hated by his brothers, sold by his brothers, has been taken all the way down from Canaan down to Egypt, where he's bought by a man named Potiphar. I mean, think of that. This young man, 17, is entirely by himself, right? His dad, who cared about him, thinks he's dead. His mom is dead. His brothers hate him, have sold him into slavery. Now he's in a foreign land, doesn't know the language. He's completely abandoned and completely alone, right? But then 39 verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. You see, he wasn't all alone. The Lord was with Joseph. Kind of reminds us of what the Lord had promised to Joseph's dad. Remember that? As God would reaffirm the promises from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, one of the things that was added or emphasized with Jacob was God's promise, I will be with you wherever you go. And now we see the offspring of Jacob. God says, the text says, God was with him. When he's all alone and no one seems to be caring for him or have any inkling of what's even happening to him, the Lord is with him and is blessing him, so much so that Potiphar, his owner, sees somehow that God's hand is with this young man. And so Potiphar eventually raises Joseph up in his house to be like the second in his house. He doesn't even care about anything because he trusts Joseph to take care of it all. Everything basically is in Joseph's hands in the house. And then we find out just a little bit into the chapter that Joseph is actually a pretty attractive young man as well. So attractive, in fact, that Potiphar's own wife wants to seduce Joseph, wants him to sleep with her. She wants him for herself. And think about it. I mean, nobody's in the house when this is going on. Nobody knows Joseph around here. He's away from all of his family. Who would see such a thing, right? But Joseph fears God, respects his master, but Joseph ultimately fears God. And when you look down at the text, he says in 39 verse 9, after refusing her advances, he says in 39 verse 9 at the end, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? But she doesn't stop after just trying one day. She speaks to him day after day. But he would not listen to her. But one day, when he went into the house and they were all alone, she grabs onto him and she wants him. And he runs from her. And what does she do? Potiphar's wife? She cries out and says, Joseph tried to rape me. Her husband Potiphar hears about this he's so angry at this situation, he throws Joseph into prison. And you think, here's Joseph, who at least for a little while was being blessed, and then as he's rising up to power, because of his fear of God and because he turned away from evil, he is judged by his master, is thrown into prison. But in the prison, verse 21, chapter 39, verse 21, what do you see? But the Lord was with Joseph even there, and showed him steadfast love. There in the prison, God is showing, I still love you, Joseph. I'm still with you. And God gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison, so that before you know it, the keeper of the prison is letting Joseph kind of have free reign there, being able to care for things. He trusts him. God is with him, and even the keeper of the prison can see it. Well, then chapter 40. We come into chapter 40, and remember Joseph, the dreamer, the one who had the dreams of having dominion, is now going to interact with dreams for a second time. But this time, God's not giving him dreams. In fact, I think if you read this story, I don't know that God ever gives him more dreams himself. I don't know that God ever appears to Joseph or speaks to Joseph like he did to his dad or his granddad or his great-grandfather. He has those dreams at the beginning, but no more that we know of. Joseph just has to cling to what he heard in those dreams and trust the Lord, but now he's interacting with dreams for a second time, but from somebody else. Joseph has been put over the other people in the prison, and what happens is Pharaoh gets angry with two of his own workers. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has a cupbearer or a butler, and he has a baker, and I don't even know if it tells us exactly what happens, but he gets angry with the cupbearer and with the baker, and so he throws them both into the prison where Joseph is. And they're there for a while, and Joseph is getting to know them. But one day, Joseph sees these guys, and they seem really troubled, and he says, "What's wrong, guys?" And they both tell him, "Hey, we had some crazy dreams last night, and there's nobody here who can tell us what they mean." And Joseph says, "Well, don't interpretations belong to God? Why don't you tell me? We'll see. We'll see what happens." And so the butler or the cupbearer says, "Hey, I had these dreams about three, what does he even talk about? I forget. Yeah, in my dream, there was a vine, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph says to the butler or the cupbearer, "Hey, this is what that dream means. In 3 days, you're going to be restored to Pharaoh." The baker, he hears this, and he hears how good the interpretation was. He says, "Hey, well, I had some dreams too." He says, "Well, what I dreamed about was that there were 3 like cake baskets on my head, and in the top basket, there was all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds kept eating it out of the basket." And Joseph tells the baker, "Hey, here's the interpretation of that dream. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift up your head and hang you, and the birds are going to eat your flesh." Well, in 3 days, what happens? Exactly what Joseph said, exactly the interpretations that God gave to him. The cupbearer is restored. Joseph pleads with the cupbearer, "Remember me when you get out of here." And the butler or the baker is taken, and he is hung, he is killed. Happens just like Joseph said. But the cupbearer, as soon as he gets restored to power, he forgets all about the Hebrew boy, the Hebrew young man down there in the prison. In fact, 2 entire years go by where Joseph is just waiting and nothing happens. The butler, the cupbearer, completely forgets about him. But then God gives somebody else a couple of dreams, 2 more dreams. And these dreams aren't going to the butler or to a baker. These are dreams in the mind and in the head of the king, of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, has strange dreams, and he can't find anyone who can interpret them. And then finally, the cupbearer who's with Pharaoh remembers, and he says, "Oh, I remember what I've done. I used to be in prison, and there was a Hebrew there who was able to interpret dreams. Pharaoh, you should find him." Pharaoh calls up Joseph after all these years. We don't even know yet how many years have gone by. He calls up Joseph and he says, "I've heard you can interpret dreams." And Joseph says, "Look, it's not in me, but God can give you the interpretations." And so then Pharaoh starts to talk with Joseph. And the dreams were crazy dreams if you read about them. Pharaoh had a dream of like 7 big juicy cows out in the field. And then there's like 7 skinny, sickly cows that show up in the dream. And I don't know what this would have looked like in the dream, but the 7 sickly cows eat the 7 big cows. And then Pharaoh had woken up and he had fallen back asleep. A second time he dreamed, and there were like 7 big ears of grain coming out of this one stalk. But then there were 7 thin, ugly-looking heads of grain or whatever that come up, and they somehow in the dream eat the 7 juicy heads of grain. And Pharaoh had woken up again, and he talks with Joseph about these things, and Joseph says, "Look, God has given me the interpretation. This is the interpretation. God is revealing to you, Pharaoh, what he's about to do in the world. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of terrible famine. And this is what God wants you to do. You need to find a wise man to help you during this time and to manage your affairs and to store up food during the 7 good years, to preserve the world, to preserve the land, and to preserve the people for the 7 years of famine which are to come." And Pharaoh hears this interpretation and he sees the wisdom that God has given to Joseph. He says something interesting even in chapter 41, verse 38. Pharaoh says to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" And he says to Joseph, "You're the man that I want to lead." And Joseph's whole life is about to change. Pharaoh lifts Joseph up out of the prison to the second in command. He puts him as the second in command of his entire nation. And now Joseph gets a wife, he has children, he has power. It's an amazing thing, all because the Lord was with him. And look at what Joseph says when he has children. It's the year before the famine comes. This is chapter 41, verse 50. 2 sons were born to Joseph. Joseph in verse 51, this is chapter 41, verse 51. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." How long has it been? If you look down at verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh. 13 years went by of Joseph languishing all alone except for God being with him, waiting for God to do what he had promised all those years before. And now Joseph is experiencing the blessing of God. God starting to fulfill what he had promised, him starting to exercise dominion, and God gives him offspring. And Joseph says, when he names his first son, "God has made me forget all the hardships." And then he has a second son. In verse 52, he calls him Ephraim because he says, "Because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering, in the land of my affliction." Well, those 7 years of plenty, they come. Joseph manages the land, stores the food. And then the famine comes. just like God has said, and it will ruin the earth if not for an offspring of Israel that God has raised up to bring blessing to all the peoples on earth.